and welcome to the Supportive Housing Working Group held on November 9th, 2022. This month's discussion topic is operating supportive housing for 30 years. My name is Joanna, and I'm the Project and Grant Coordinator for Nevada Housing Coalition. I wanted to tee up the discussion for you because we started recording this meeting a little late. We are diving right in with Brooke Page, the SH Director of the Southwest Region, explaining why the passage of SB 12 was so important to preserving affordable housing. Don't forget to sign up for future discussions on supportive housing on our website linked below. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy the discussion.
Right, so this is a really important legislation in our state that I think was really an important one that we were able to move forward in the last legislative session and got approved. Thanks so much to former Senator Julia Ratty, who helped to ensure that this was actually heard. And so we know that 90% of Nevada's affordable housing stock has some form of low-income housing tax credits in it, right? And that's an important piece to actually create affordable housing. And so those low-income housing tax credits require an affordability requirement. But what happens after that 30 years when that unit, especially let's say, for example, we've got a mom and pop who has a duplex development and they've keeping the units affordable, they're making enough to pay their mortgage, and they probably are making maybe a little bit more to help them in their retirement. But now the 30 years is up and they've got an opportunity, a private developer, a private investor wants to buy that duplex from them for $1 million. And they're like, that could be really great for me right now, right? So what's the incentive for them to even keep that affordable unit in the stock, right? If that investor comes in, takes it over, maybe they demolish that fourplex and create a luxury high-rise property on that land. Now we no longer have those affordable units that are helping keep a senior who's on a fixed Social Security income in a unit that's affordable. So this is an issue that we recognize as a state we need to do something about, and that's where the opportunity came to create SB 12. And so from the provisions of the bill, it really is just an opportunity to signal, one, that there is a property that is up for affordability. Folks need to be notified. Tenants need to be notified. The community needs to be notified. Funders need to be notified that this affordability period is coming open. And if an owner is intending on selling, those, we need to know as much in advance as possible. So that way we can at least either buy that property and get it so where we can keep it in the affordability pipeline and have it available for units to be affordable, or at least notify the tenants that this unit is going to be sold and they may lose that affordability component and need to find other options well in advance of just tomorrow getting an eviction notice from somebody, right? So this is an opportunity to have that notification. And so I think this is, just important steps for our state to kind of be addressing this affordability crisis. Other states across the country have done similar, but that early notification is really, really important, and a provision that helps us keep and preserve affordable housing. So that's a long-winded response, but I'll just kind of pause there to see if there's any follow-up to that.
It looks like we have some questions in the chat.
Okay.
The first one, I saw it, now I gotta scroll back. Was wondering, I can answer the question about the self-assessment tool online. And when you say we repurchasing property for affordable housing, who do you mean?
When we say we are purchasing the property, so I think this is more something that I think we're having as a state and even as a coalition, right? Do we really have the resources to purchase and keep units affordable in our stock? And is there a need to have a pool of money available, either at funding available in our housing trust fund or funding available in different funding structures to be able to purchase that development and purchase that land or purchase that property, so that we don't lose that affordability and we can keep it with those contractual requirements that no longer are required, but we may, the government may want to step in and at least keep it and maintain that affordability, because they aren't in it for that maybe profit-driven reason why that property is actually up to be sold. So those are the things, like, we need to be able to be competitive in those moments to for that mom and pop example, so that way they can find, maybe they don't want to be in this business anymore and they're waiting for that affordability period to sell it. They might have requirements with the investor that they need to maintain it, that affordability, for as long as they can. So I think that's kind of the hypothetical is like, do we have the infrastructure as a state and fund and government to step in and purchase that property?
Hey, Brooke, if I can add on too,
Yeah.
and I see Bill is looking for even more clarification. It could be government, right? Some local governments may prioritize preservation and have funding set aside to make it happen quickly. But that is the trick, is coming up with the funding. In our case, with 12 months notification, not enough time, you're probably doing a bridge financing. That's where CDFIs, Community Development Finance institutions can come into play, because they'll often bridge the financing until you put all of the other pieces together. But it also might be nonprofits, right? One of the notifications goes to the housing division, who in turn notifies nonprofit developers who might have an interest in preserving these. So we could be you, right? Because you might be the nonprofit that says, oh my gosh, we cannot afford to lose those 30 units in Reno. And a lot of those clients are people that meet our mission and who we serve. How can we step in? City of Reno, state of Nevada, what do we need to do to make this happen and preserve those projects? So hopefully that's helpful too.
Yeah. Thanks, Christine.
So one of the next questions is thinking about the challenges of 30-year operating plan in terms of sustainability. And I wanted to ask Kevin, what are some of the best practices around sustaining the operations portion of supportive housing in a single site model? But Kevin, before you get into that, some of the questions that we got ahead of time, and some of the folks on this call are actually new to our supportive housing trainings and education. So could you also talk about it sort of in the context of how supportive housing is different from transitional or short-term housing, and what the partnerships might look like in as opposed to other affordable housing or homeless services models?
Yeah, that's a lot in one question. So if I forget to answer any parts of that, just let me know, okay? So when I think about permanent supportive housing or supportive housing, depending on how you know it, I think of it as permanent. So people have the option to live where they choose for as long as they want to. So I think foundationally, that's the difference between permanent supportive housing or supportive housing versus transitional housing or some of those other housing types that we see. I also recognize that it's geared and found in the foundation of support services, meaning that people are not only offered those services, but they are also being progressively engaged in those services. So they have a choice in those services, and that housing is affordable. So people are not paying no more than 30% of their incomes. They have a lease assigned to them as well. So oftentimes with transitional housing projects, we have different leasing models. So I think take into account, the permanency of permanent supportive housing versus transitional housing. That's one of the core tenets of it. And then also recognizing housing first, trauma-informed care, as well as harm reduction as some of those evidence-based practices within the permanent supportive housing model as an intervention. And I think also for the second part of that question, in terms of what does it look like differently to stand up supportive housing versus maybe more affordable housing models where they're targeting different populations. I think for myself, and my teammates can add here, I think the needs are fundamentally different when we're looking at affordable housing versus sometimes that permanent supportive housing tenant population. And oftentimes when we are thinking about what does the difference look like in standing up those programs, you may need more funding for support services or funding for operational cost for services such as 24-hour security and other things of that nature, whereas you may not need that in another type of affordable housing development. So I think just thinking about the needs of the population will also dictate what does that services support or capacity look like, as well as what does that property management or operational capacity look like on a day-to-day basis.
And I'll just say the design features too. I'll just add that, like the need to really recognize if we're talking about a certain subset of folks, maybe people with disabling conditions, you know, we really want to be informing the project about that tenant population. What is it that they're going to need? And so that's going to, you know, it might be easier to do a cookie cutter approach with the traditional affordable housing, but if we really are trying to meet people where they are, how do we make sure that we're designing it to meet their needs too?
And in terms of sustaining the operations for, say, a 30-year operating plan, what does that look like for supportive housing for a single site model?
Yeah, I think it looks a few different ways, and I think there's a few different tools that we can use, and we've seen a lot of that emerge out of some of the practices that HUD is putting forward, especially with like some of the home ARP funds that are coming down the pipeline. So I think just generally across the board, when we're thinking about that pre-development phase, whenever you can engage with your public housing authority at that pre-development phase, I always encourage that level of engagement to see what is the capacity for any project-based vouchers. So just foundationally there, engaging with the public housing authority. One thing that just occurred yesterday, in the city of Austin, they voted for Preposition A, which was a $350 million affordable housing bond coming out of Austin to fund affordable housing. So, you know, I think bonds are another way that we can, you know, target some of that sustainability around operations. And then also, in Texas, one of the set aside funding sources for our home ARP funds is capitalized operations subsidy reserves. And we're starting to see a lot of that work being done nationwide and highlighted nationwide. And if you're not familiar with the capitalized operation subsidy reserve, it's a funding source or a funding mechanism that's a set aside at the beginning of a project to help with some of those projected operating deficits. So it allows you to to bring over some of those funding and have it as a reserve to help with some of those operating subsidies. But one of the things you have to be careful and mindful about when using the subsidy reserve is just really defining what are your operating costs. So again, as you think about that pre-development phase and you're starting to contact the housing authority, really fleshing out what are some of those operational costs or some of those things that are coming out of your operational budget will be really helpful as you start thinking about and start planning for a capitalized operating subsidy reserve. And I can also include that information from HUD, a fact sheet that they have here. And I see some links coming in. I don't know, JD, if that's one of the links you were talking about, but I can include that link from HUD here. I'm not sure. I don't think it's something Nevada prioritized, but that is something that we are starting to see a lot of states include in their eligible uses to help with the sustainability related to operational costs.
So yeah, it's just a link to the RFP for the home and home ARP coming through the Washoe County Home Consortium. So I know you had mentioned through that. So there's some priorities laid out in there as well. I just wanted folks to be aware of where that's living locally as well.
Perfect. Thank you, JD.
Yeah, no worries.
We actually had some good questions ahead of time that I think relate to this, some of these like 30-year planning and operating. One was, does the organization own the property that owns the property hold the deed? And I know we talked a little bit that it can look different ways. But some of the questions are, should the board tighten up or have more rigorous safeguards, or does this increase the risk of corrupt action since the organization has a valuable asset? I think since these are coming from Steve, a board member from the RISE program up in Reno, and they operate some homeless services, but they don't yet have any housing programs. So maybe from the perspective of someone who would be maybe trying to develop their very first project.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we've been hearing and getting a lot of feedback on in terms of ownership models and structures as it relates to permanent supportive housing in the development pipeline. For myself, I always give the guidance of, you know, just being as clear as possible when you're approaching some of your future partners and what is that ownership and that shared ownership structure look like? And then also, what does that roles and responsibilities of each partner look like throughout that development process, from pre-development all the way through operations of that project? So for me, that's something, again, that I think in terms of identifying partners and ironing out some of those finalized like memorandums of understanding, MOUs, it's something that you all, flesh out throughout that deal-making process.
So I can jump in on that a little bit as well. And not to get in the weeds too much with it, but generally it's the developer that kind of leads the effort to identify the land and purchase the land. And it could be that, as Christine said earlier, it could be that a local unit of government or the state had purchased the land originally because they wanted it preserved for affordable housing. And then if I were the developer, I'd be negotiating with that local government on price, on structure, and how that piece of the deal is made. If it's a tax credit deal, low-income housing tax credit deal, limited partner is actually going to be the owner of the land at that point. So whoever is buying your tax credits for that 15-year period, and there are significant safeguards that are put in place in the limited partnership agreement that is signed by whoever that investor is and the developer. So in my case, when I was at Clare Housing and we built a new property, we worked with a syndicator, National Equity Fund, and the limited partnership agreement was between us and NEF. At that 15-year mark is when the property can shift from the limited partner, which was National Equity Fund, to me, or Clare Housing as the developer of the property. And we had first right of refusal to purchase that land, or purchase the building and the land at that time. And that's when Clare Housing would have gotten the deed. We have to fulfill a number of requirements in the limited partnership agreement, and then the deed would be shifted over to us. I'm hoping that kind of gets at that question and helps kind of understand that structure a little bit.
And maybe to follow up, Chuck, I'm guessing in that example, like NEF would, during that 15-year period, being the primary owner, they would be working with Clare Housing as the developer and operator, doing regular audits, right? Both financial, physical inspections, ensuring that their assets being managed properly. So that's kind of the safeguard in the syndicator example, as well as it's a institution or syndicator that has that both the financial capability and record to carry a project through that 15-year period and ensure that things are being run properly. If that, maybe that helps too.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. I totally forgot about that. That is the big part of the safeguard that is in place at that time.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions about this specific topic? Feel free to unmute and ask questions or use the chat function.
I'm just going to put in the chat a document. Hopefully you all can download it. That'll have the advantages and disadvantages of a single owner operator versus shared ownership. That could be helpful to this conversation.
Great.
So there's a question, Bill, around capitalized operating reserve and the tool for establishing a reserve. It's interesting my understanding, it comes down to the state housing agency that's issuing the tax credits, kind of who is responsible for setting up those reserves. In Minnesota, the capital reserve and operating reserve was set up as part of our tax credit deal, and NEF, when they awarded us those dollars in exchange for the tax credits, a certain portion of those dollars went and created a capital reserve and an operating reserve as well. And I know some states do not require that, and then the developer or whoever is the limited partner with the syndicator is going to end up being responsible for creating those reserves as well. And those reserves are a critical piece of the operation sustainability as well. particularly if you're not able to balance the bottom line of the operating expenses, you're able to draw on those reserves to fill that gap.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. This is very interesting. It's a lot to consider when you're developing projects, but definitely a worthwhile cause and a long commitment, which is good because we need long-term solutions for ending homelessness, right? The next question I wanted to talk about was about supportive services. We hear from several members the challenges they face when trying to secure funding for supportive services. I've been having a lot of conversations over the last 6 months as I have been in my role here at the coalition. And that is one of the major barriers that comes up is who's going to fund these long-term subsidies, who's going to fund these long-term supportive services. Can you share some suggestions or best practices about service funding that is sustainable and long-term? And then I'll also have some follow-up questions from some of the attendees that sent ahead of time as well.
So this is a great question that everybody asks every time we go out and do the Supportive Housing Institute or the Academy is, how do we fund services? And it certainly is a challenging question. And I experienced the same thing in Minnesota as Executive Director of Clare Housing, trying to piece together different funding streams to be able to cover services. One thing I'll share, we are in the process of putting together a funding matrix for Nevada, as well as Arizona and Texas, and we'll be doing the same in Utah and New Mexico as well, that will list and give links and information about all the resources in Nevada that actually will fund services for supportive housing. So stay tuned for that. It is coming, but that'll be one resource for you. But where I started with looking at service dollars was state government, because more than likely than not, state government is going to be there with that funding for the long term and for those 30 years versus philanthropy dollars, private philanthropy. You're at the whim of a foundation changing their guidelines, deciding that they no longer want to fund you. So that's the first place that I would look, and most cases, it's your housing finance agency will have funding available. It could be a housing trust fund or other type of funding. The Department of Health and Human Services, in some states they're one, others they're split. You will oftentimes find funding there that will cover specific activities. Home and community-based service funding is a tool we used in Minnesota because it was designed to provide services for those folks that were coming out of an institution and needed to have 24/7 supports. So that was how our Medicaid waiver was set up in Minnesota. So we were paid a monthly fee per individual based on their needs assessment in terms of what level of needs they needed and what level of support. So those monthly reimbursements were anywhere from about $1,000 a month to, I think our highest was maybe $2,900 a month. And we billed the Department of Human Services directly for that. We did not have to bill Medicaid for those dollars as well. Another area of funding to look at is your local COCs. And every COC has different priorities and different areas that they're working on. And again, Minnesota is my frame of reference. They were not interested in funding supportive housing. So we really weren't even eligible for funding through the COC because they were putting their dollars elsewhere. So look at your local COCs in terms of potential funding. And thank you, Terry, for raising that many services are eligible as Medicaid reimbursements. That's absolutely correct. Many of you have probably heard of a lot of states that are applying for new waivers and waiting to be approved. I know Nevada is in the process of putting together an application and proposal, so there's time to be able to provide input in terms of how that waiver is structured to be able to provide services. Arizona just got approved by the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, and ours are going towards some tenancy supports, transitional housing for 6 months, and a few other areas as well where we'll be able to support. So that absolutely is another source of revenue. And if, you know, watch where Nevada lands, and I'm guessing we will keep you updated as we hear information, or the association will, Joanna or Christine as well. So we'll watch that as well. What am I missing? Oh, and COC is Continuum of Care. So it's a program, oh my gosh, I'm not even gonna say, it's a program of HUD in Washington, DC. I'm not as familiar with COC, and provides dollars for primarily homeless population. And I will defer to my esteemed colleagues if they wanna chime in on the COC, because it's not my expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Chuck. And I'm sorry I put it out there because I heard you use an acronym and I'm like,
oh,
let's make sure we define that. So yeah, the Continuum of Care, we've got 3 of them in Nevada, and they cover a lot of the homeless service provision funding for emergency, really rapid rehousing, transitional housing, and permanent supportive housing. And so there are resources that could be used for services. So thank you, Chuck, for that great explanation. And
sure.
We do have an update on where we are as far as the Medicaid space. Nevada is moving, and there's conversations that are going to be, as Sarah put in the chat, on December 1st, there's going to be an opportunity for folks to provide some public comment around an in lieu of services option for tenancy support services. So I think we're shifting away from the traditional 1915I tenancy supports that we originally thought that authority was going to be the tool that was going to be used to help with that Medicaid reimbursement for services. But I think now we just learned that it's going to now be the in lieu of services option. So
if I can just add one thing on the, I guess both to Kevin's and to Chuck's points there on just the stability of operations and specifically services. One thing that we found really successful, at least in the Utah market, and I know prices are increasing a lot, but it's to anchor at least, depending on the size of the property, to anchor at least one or part of one FTE in the operating budget dedicated to services. That can be really difficult when you're trying to pencil a project. If you have a project that cash flows well, those that maybe are using subsidy like a project-based voucher through a housing authority, things like that, where you can afford that extra salary, that's great. It's also a recommendation, at least that's been used and we've seen successful in Utah, is when you are chasing funding to fund services, to really also look at that as a separate bucket and not try to fund the whole works, right? Like if you just try to focus on, you know, if you could secure funding for one person for X number of years and just trying to keep at least that anchored. And what that does is that takes the service coordination off property management, who they're not service providers, and it takes it off the developer, they're not service providers, and the owner, right? They're not service providers. So it anchors that position with the property, and it does give some security and assurances to the investors and the residents that, you know, services will be offered and that coordination will fall on that individual who's an expert in that field. Again, it comes down to money, and that's, you know, the question. But I think as advocates for supportive housing, I think people hate to hear it when you're meeting with developers, but I think it's important to keep bringing that up, even if it's one position, reminding folks that, hey, we need to remember if we can fund, you know, one position or half a position to dedicate coordination to. That's at least in Utah.
So, oh, sorry, Mindy, I know you have a question. I just want to follow up really quickly because we have a question ahead of time about COC funding for special populations. Like say an organization wants to serve a particular population with specific behavioral health issues. Would the COC be the first place to go for those kinds of funding, or would it be the same answer for any type of population you're surveying?
I'll take a stab at this because I think this is important when we're talking about supportive housing, that we don't necessarily develop our program design based on funding sources initially, right? We really need to develop our program. Who is the target population that we want to serve? What are all the needs of that population? And what is the program offerings and the quality of care that we want to make sure is embedded in our supportive housing plan? And then based off of that plan, then we sort of then go to what are the funding sources that are available in the community, at the state, at the federal level, at the foundational level, to help fund what we know is needed in order to do this work and do it well, to pay the staff the hours and the wages necessary, so that way they are doing this work in a way that's that they have a livable wage and can be competitive to work in this industry. So it's almost like really thinking about us creating the best option and then going out and finding and figuring out how to pencil the project from there. And I think that's why the document that Chuck mentioned is so important for us to have in the state, because that'll give us the lay of the land of the various different funding sources that can help us fund services, and figure out that affordability period of how long we're going to fund it for. But we shouldn't try to create the plan based on the money, because then we're never going to ever meet the need for the population.
Great point, Brooke. Mendy?
Yeah, that's a great, Brooke, that's, you and I have had these conversations about this already, about is it the chicken or the egg? I just wanted to back up. Chuck, you piqued my interest when you talked about the reimbursement, and I might be getting ahead of myself, the $1,000 to $2,900 and that allocation that's coming from, I'm assuming, your DHHS, your Department of Health and Human Services, I think you said. Is that funding coming through the Medicaid, or is that funding that's coming through the state, or where are those funds coming? Because it piqued my interest, because certainly that would be and yet an incentive to know that there's dollars coming in on a monthly basis to a developer or to a partnership or LLC that wants to develop a permanent supportive housing project.
Yeah, so Minnesota was a Medicaid expansion state, so the state had to put additional dollars in as well. So it was a combination of Medicaid federal dollars and then state dollars as well. And the tool, they had devised this tool, the name of the waiver was a CADI waiver. It's Community Alternatives for Disabled Individuals, which on a side note, I'm not sure still exists, because I left in 2019 just as we were transferring to the new waiver. But there was a flow chart that we had to fill out for each client, dictating what their need was, how much they need, and then there was a rate attached to that service and specifically. And then they used some calculation. I'm not a finance person, and they came up with what the monthly rate was. So we didn't bill by 15-minute increments. We had what some call a bundled rate, and we billed the state, Minnesota Department of Human Services, once a month for those dollars. And it funded, as I said, it allowed us to provide heightened services for about 30 to 35 clients who had high medical needs. So it allowed us to have a registered nurse in 2 buildings, and it funded half of a salary of a director of nursing, and then some of our front desk staff positions were covered as well through that.
And could you make the argument, because you're bundling the services and you're being proactive rather than reactive, that in the end you're actually potentially saving money?
Yeah, we actually did a study on that, on those clients, where we found we were saving the state about $500,000 a year in unnecessary, in Medicaid expenses, by having nurses on staff in the building who could do exactly what you said. We were preventing a lot of emergency room visits and hospital visits by being able to do that.
Okay, thank you. I am a finance person, so I'm really intrigued with that one. So thank you.
Yeah, and you could go to the Minnesota Department of Human Services website, and if it still exists, it'll have all of that in there as well, how it's calculated and everything. It's part of the home and community-based services program.
Hey, Joanna, this is JD. I have a possibly stupid question. So,
No stupid questions.
so I know that we talk about capitalizing like operating or maintenance reserves. Are there models in which you capitalize like fund upfront in a significant amount for services? And how does that work? Are there folks that do that or have tried that?
I can jump in, JD, on that. That was actually with the second building that we did. That was my question to NEF, because the Minnesota Department of Housing required those reserves, but they wouldn't fund them, so they had to come out of LIHTC. They required the syndicator to pay for the capital and operating reserves. And I did ask them, I said, why can't we have a service reserve and structure it so it would pay a gap each year in that service funding, and it would be reassessed every year how much we would draw down or use. And NEF just could not get the fund that's buying the tax credits to agree with it, and they had never done anything like that before, so it was a new idea to them. What we did end up doing is that project had tax increment financing through the city of Robbinsdale. And so what would happen is we would only pay a portion of the taxes, and then the city we'd pay the whole tax, and then the city would pay back to us a certain percentage of that. And I did get NEF to allow me to have those dollars put into a service reserve to be able to start to build a reserve, but NEF didn't put any of the tax credit money into it. That I have, and there may be other examples, but I haven't heard of any.
I recently was speaking to a colleague out of our Detroit office that has worked in Illinois as well. And one of the things she mentioned briefly was there's a nonprofit developer in that area that uses a portion of their development fee to go into a services reserve throughout the life of that project. So that's something that was new to me to hear, but very interesting. But again, they're a nonprofit developer, and that's just their best practice for working with nonprofit providers.
I think also in Denver, I feel like their qualified allocation plan allows for a basis boost for some similar types of strategies to be able to have a reserve for service funding.
There's also, lots of innovative ways to fund programs, and every nonprofit is familiar with fundraising, right? So, so there's also, I know a lot of nonprofits that do a lot of invest a lot in their development and fundraising departments to have an ongoing presence in the community and fund with private funders and get donations. Not that it's a reliable way to fund services, but to rearrange, it's another sort of component of funding. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about partnerships and property management. So often we hear about the tension.
Joanna,
yes.
I'm sorry. Before you move on from this subject, the question I had was on the continuum of care covering services. It was kind of the opposite. We have a plan with a targeted population, and the QAP in Nevada actually has a line in it that says you cannot give preference to a specific population. So I was assuming that came from the continuum of care. And that's my question is, does the continuum of care prohibit you from giving preference to a specific population that might be, that you might be targeting because that's how you're designing your project?
That's a great question, Lori. Does anybody from the team have an answer?
I'm not aware of any concerns from the continuum of care perspective around excluding a particular population. I know that there's actually an encouragement to sort of have target specific projects, whether it be for families or youth. And so I think this kind of butts up against fair housing law, and kind of when we talk about tenant selection plans and the need to make sure that we aren't excluding folks based off of protected class. And so I think if that's where the rubber meets the road, there are strategies in which folks may have access to preferences that can be written into a tenant selection plan to sort of address these concerns. But I'll see if any of my colleagues have any thoughts on that.
I think also too, Lori, because if I'm understanding your question, it was about really trying to target units for individuals with that chronic and long ongoing behavioral health disorder. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and I from the COC's perspective, when they're looking at defining certain populations, what you'll often see is disabling conditions. So what that means, it doesn't limit it to behavioral health diagnoses. They'll take into account other diagnoses into that definition as well. So they may ask you to be more broad in that disabling conditions category if you didn't want to focus on, let's say, youth, families, or like a subpopulation of that nature. Is that helpful to you?
Kind of, because I know that often this population also has physical disabilities, but because the service provider will be able to provide care, we would like to give preference. And we're only talking about preferences. We're not talking about excluding one, just giving preferences to a population that can use the services of our on-site staff, and also the design, of the building will be, everything will be kind of done with that in mind. So that's why we want to give preference. So that you think that there are strategies. What I heard Brooke say is, it sounds like there's strategies that we can use as long as to make sure we're not in violation of fair housing, and then it would be okay.
Yep. And I think too, depending upon the funding source with the COC, if there was a bonus project that you all are applying for services funding, and that bonus project was only eligible for chronically homeless populations, you would have to meet that definition of chronically homeless to be in compliance with that COC component. So that's where, layering and braiding these funding sources to ensure that we're meeting compliance with the COC money, but then also over here on the tenant selection plans, we're also making sure we have written preferences that doesn't violate fair housing. So I think that's kind of where some of that requires just some finessing.
I'm just also going to weigh in, if I can, Juana, before we pivot quickly. And I'm still learning about COCs and all that. That's a little bit not different, certainly related to affordable housing, right? Particularly in housing people. And I think I've recently been participating in a working group, and we were discussing exactly this, how our COCs in Nevada support service investments, right, for housing. And I think for this group here, I don't have solutions, but I think that there's opportunity in Nevada to really expand and be maybe more strategic and intentional with service investments by our COC that are associated with permanent housing or housing. So I guess that's just going to be my comment. And I'm definitely still learning, and I'm excited about this conversation. Thank you.
I am too, because we don't do it. And other states leverage the COC with the affordable housing tools. And so figuring out how to do this in a way that's complementary with timing, because the timing is always different with when the COC NOFA drops and all the things, but how do we ensure that we can leverage those resources for services, capital, using the affordable housing tools for capital development? Like, I think this requires more interaction with the COC.
Yeah, those are all really good points. And talking about how to lease up your building as well, where to get your clients, right? Like how your clients are getting access to your services and your units in your building is a big question too. Maybe we could probably have a whole nother session on that. So we're talking a little bit, we only have this has been such a great conversation. We're running out of time. So I wonder if maybe I'll just open it up to questions, because people might just have general questions about supportive housing, people who are new to the supportive housing working group, or questions about upcoming events, or questions for the team about your project specifically. Since we're running short, we only have about 8 minutes left. And if nobody has questions, then I'll just keep talking for 8 minutes.
I have a question, Joanna. I'm going to perpetually ask this question, but I'm wondering, especially in supportive housing space around the country, what are best practices in terms of like a local government's role? Because oftentimes I think we're thinking federal or state dollars, and I'm wondering if anyone on the team can speak to best practices, both like in capital financing, but also and maybe more flexible funding for services.
Thank you, JD. Excellent.
Go ahead, Brooke.
No, go ahead. I'll wait for mine.
I'm not sure I know best practices. I just know in Minnesota, the city of Minneapolis did receive an allocation of tax credits that they were able to award specifically to projects in Minneapolis. So that was one stream of funding that came through the city. Hennepin County used home funds that was part of their plan for those funds for capital. And they also provided limited services, but they were more on the capital side as well. And then we in Minnesota have a regional county system, and I'm totally forgetting the name of it, but they also had a pool of funds for affordable housing, particularly if you were building in a transit-oriented district where the new light rail was going through or whatever. There were incentives to build there. There could be dollars awarded as well. So I think it's common practice. I can't say out of expertise that a lot of cities and county local governments are starting to fund more services. What I am hearing is counties in particular are really reluctant to do operating subsidies because if they do it for one, how do they say no to others and set that practice around that? And that was our experience in Minnesota. So others may have a different opinion, but Brooke, I'll pass it back to you.
No, I was just going to actually have another comment on the local level. There's some examples happening in Measure H, Triple H, obviously in the county of Los Angeles, and kind of really having dedicated funding for supportive housing. Those measures have just created a fund because we know we can't just do this with tax credits alone, and we know we need service money. So having a dedicated resource that's funding it. Multnomah County actually passed a measure as well to infuse at the local level a tax in order to fund services for that affordability period. So I think without the resources, it's kind of hard to do this on an ongoing basis, but that's just the first two that come to mind.
Yeah, I'd like to also add, I think the more local funders can start looking at their existing funding sources and where their funds are actually going, and starting to align some of those funding sources to actually create the development of supportive housing and actually a procurement strategy around developing supportive housing, that could really help with a pipeline at the local level, looking at those home sources, COC funding sources, to just, see what that looks like from that local supports level. And I think also thinking about the position that some of those local agencies are in terms of the point in time count, the housing inventory count, you have that data. So really looking at that data and seeing where your funds are being expended, I think that could be really helpful to start, overcoming some of those issues that we're seeing at the local level. So procurement strategies for sure.
Yeah, maybe lastly, just partnering and aligning yourself with affordable housing advocates, and specifically affordable housing advocates that, or you being an advocate for deeply affordable housing. I think a lot of times in the affordable housing space, we hear 50% or higher AMI as the benchmark. And we all know that's not affordability when we're talking about supportive housing, as Kevin greatly outlined earlier. So really being that voice of, as a reminder, what about the 30%, right? Like, what are the incentives for those developers? Because we can have developers in the 50 to 80% all day long, get these incentives for transit-oriented projects, all of those things, right? But that's not going to help deeply subsidized affordable housing for those most in need. Yeah, it's going to increase housing stock, but it's not going to help the populations we're talking about.
Thank you for saying that, Russell. Like, that's the difference, I think, of where we are as a state and really thinking about how do we prioritize this intervention. And it was going to require coalition building. And I know Sarah put in the chat the BDR that's currently being proposed to really help address having some dedicated resources for supportive housing. That's going to require advocacy. It's going to require folks to testify and to be at the front lines to really help these conversations move forward. Without that advocacy, we're not going to have the resources that we need to do this and do it well. So I just really appreciate that point, Russell.
Awesome. I really appreciate that point too. And, you know, feel free to reach out and get in contact with the team if you have more questions about what's possible and what we can do to really build momentum. Big theme, big word theme for the coalition. Those of you who were at our conference last month, towards getting some really not just supporting each of you in building your own projects with your organizations, but really building a culture of accepting this intervention as a standard in our state, and getting a pipeline of projects going, working together so that we can have some ongoing resources and reliable movement towards getting those units that we have the most gap in our state for our most vulnerable population. So unless there's any final comments, I want to thank everybody for coming. For those of you who are really interested, particularly in this advocacy side of things and really moving forward and working towards solutions in our state, and continue to stay engaged with the coalition and with CSH so that we can really build a team of people working towards this together, like a real working group where we have goals and solutions for the end. And that's what we really want to do coming in year 2 and year 3 of the Elevate Nevada project. So please stay engaged and call me if you have any questions. Thank you.